and commenced weapon training for the units. Within a week, we took delivery of a single 3-inch mortar barrel and a few mortar bombs. We also received a number of rifles and ammunition. This greatly boosted our morale. I sent the mortar barrel to the 12th Battalion and distributed the small arms between the 12th and the 19th battalions. Now let me take another break. Call it a tea break. One moment, please. For my friends on TikTok. So there is a bit of verify this, verify that stuff. Thank you so much, okay, for listening and at the same time for sharing it. Inviting those that probably should be listening to this. A lot of people can sit back and enjoy this book, like savor it, digest it, and be able to even like process it, learn from it. Okay, do not become a narcissistic bigot. Do not inherit the enemies mentioned in this book. So learn from them, be better, and never make their mistakes again. There are those who wanted to read it, but do not really have the time. And listening in could do a lot of help in actually, you digesting the content of a book you've read so much about. Some of it have been so misinterpreted. A lot of people have used it for their different agendas. But you who is listening, right? The chance there for you is to actually understand the content, the motive, including every other exposés that came to light from it too. And do not make their mistakes. Because we are reading about the decisions, the actions of men of yesteryears, whose actions and inactions led us to where we are today. We are the men of today, men and women of today. Our own children will be reading about us in 40, 50 years' time. And if we couldn't really learn from all of this and be better, then we can consider ourselves possibly a failure, not any way better. But let us continue. Because I've had my tea break now. Thank you. So, the 12th Battalion actively went to work, engaging the enemy, location at the Siluko Hill. A little amount of reconnaissance was carried out, and the lone mortar was fixed towards the enemy location, even without setting instruments. Instruments rather. It's actually like sight setting instruments rather. As fortune would have it on that evening, the first mortar bomb fell directly into the pot of soup of the enemy. You have never seen such a terrible scampering in all your life. The battalion commander told me hours later. The enemy abandoned the pot and the soup and the plates and their weapons and what have you, taken into their vehicles, including a ferret. They fled at full speed. At Ore Junction, they told their tales of woe and fear to the accompanying commander. They made it seem as if the whole of the Biafran army was descending on them. He too, without doubting their story, packed bags and baggage and abandoned their Ore position. It was the biggest and almost the only victory of the Liberation Army in the Midwest region. The 12th Battalion took over the Ore position and advanced to Okitipupa on the seaside. Our next plan was to advance to Ondo and so set our feet firmly in the west. From Ondo, we were to advance on 2 axes to Ibadan, the Ore Ijebu Ibadan axis and the Ondo Ife Ibadan axis. However, many civilian supporters soon came to us at Ore to warn us that federal troops had occupied Ondo and that we should go there in full strength to take them. Really? Are you listening? The moment the people, civilians, cited this Liberation Army, they were reporting the position and location of the Nigerian army. This time around, you can say the Gowon Army. They wanted this Liberation Army to take them. Go and take them. They are in Ondo. Go with Fufoso. Fufoso, kind of. I can only imagine that, right? Anyway, a young officer was quickly sent to Ondo to survey the strength of the enemy. The young officer reported that the enemy was a division of 2 brigades. On hearing this report, Lieutenant Colonel Akaga refused to go and face them with a single battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Igboba also refused to mobilize his makeshift battalion on the ground that they were not fit to be pitched against that formidable force. The type that was already showing the hell to Biafra at Nsukka, in quotes. That was what that officer said, Officer Igboba. This was the beginning of our trouble in the Midwest sector. From then on, any plan to move further west from Ore along Ijebu-Ode-Ibadan axis was strongly resisted by Lieutenant Colonel Akaga, who argued very forcefully and reasonably that if we moved westward, we would immediately be cut off from Biafra through any or several of their northern approaches to the main Onitsha-Agbo, Benin, Ore, Ijebu-Ode road. And he was neither prepared nor willing to be cut off from Biafra and finished in the west. In war, one is either advancing or retreating. The state of standing still could not be kept for long. The federal troops commander cleverly abandoned their Ijebu-Ode axis to us because he knew that we were strong along that line and concentrated mainly on the northern axis of Ondo, Ikare, Okene, with a view to entering the Midwest from the north, so as to attack us from the rear. Meanwhile, we held the ground firmly at Ore. Our plan to move further westward on that axis had not been abandoned, but a debate raged fiercely between the revolutionary Nigerian and daring group on the one hand, and the reactionary conservative Biafran group on the other. Brigadier Banjo, Lieutenant Colonel Ifeajuna, and Major Alale typified the first group, while Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, Akaga, and Major Okonkwo typified the other. The revolutionary group wanted us to carry on the advance, enlist the support of the West, and pursue a national fight against the feudal NPC revisionists. This was the first time since January 1966 that there was a nucleus of a force that desired once again to revolutionize Nigeria. But the reactionary group wanted us to remain in the Midwest, declare it the Republic of Benin, and fight for its defense in the same way as in Biafra. Although arguments were sound on both sides, the ground did not seem tenable beneath either foot. And whether the ground was tenable or not, here was a clear case of dangerous disagreement at the top over the most vital matter of strategy at a most delicate moment in wartime. How would this terrible conflict be resolved? What chances had we of making it either way? What chances are we making it either way? Ojuku's first reaction was to recall Banjo from Benin. He kept the latter in Enugu for many days. Meanwhile, I was running the divisional headquarters with the assistance of Major Ogbu and a few officers. Many visitors were calling from Enugu for various undisclosed reasons. Major Alale also called frequently. Alale was a lecturer in politics at the former Kwame Nkrumah Institute of Ideological Studies. He was a very interesting character, mercurial, intellectual, revolutionary, dialectical, and above all, a great orator. However, he very rarely discussed with anybody. He already lectured everybody, individually and in groups. He was said to have lately married a relation of the head of state of Biafra. Wherever Alale pitched his intellectual camp, it was always difficult to dislodge him. At first, in the eastern region with Ojuku, later in Biafra with the revolutionaries. When once I explained to him the hopelessness of the Biafra military situation, he at once lectured me on he at once lectured me on his pet theme: revolutionary must never despair. I learned at once that I should never say much to him because it would be a waste of time. One particular group came from Enugu, disguised as political commissars, with the duty to help me with the political aspect of the Midwest war. Oddly enough, they had neither experience nor training for the job and wanted me to give them the necessary training. I believed them and I organized classes for them on elementary tactics and how to undo soldiers in the battlefield. In response, they asked me many intelligent but sensitive questions. At the close of the first day, they seemed to have heard enough and asked for permission to return to Enugu and come back. But they never did. It was then that I realized that they were Ojuku's secret agents. They expected me to speak against Ojuku, but were disappointed. That was Biafra. There were very many secret agents. It was therefore easy for revolutionary officers like Banjo and Alale to fall foul of them and land in Ojuku's net. Especially Alale, who spoke of revolution everywhere, every time, and to everybody. Banjo was not talkative. Banjo was not a talkative, but he was brutally frank and did not conceal his criticism of Ojuku at any time. I spoke to him quietly about this, and I feared for him, but he would not change. It was 2 weeks after our success at Ore, when suddenly I saw Colonel Evenso at my headquarters. He was looking quiet, distraught, and sick. What has happened? I asked. He spoke quietly. Federal troops had taken into the Midwest from Okene. They shelled his forward company location for more than 12 hours before moving in. They dislodged him completely and advanced 3 miles southwards. He regrouped his men and the numerous casualties were evacuated. He was still keeping his headquarters at Auchi, but badly needed reinforcements by way of personnel, support weapons, and ammunition. Moreover, he was sick and would want another commander to replace him. I considered the need for a rest to Evenso while I sent for Igboba to relieve him personally and reinforce the 11th with its 19th battalion. Besides that, there was nothing by way of reinforcement that I could send to that front. Although we had captured over 100 mortar bombs at Ore, their own barrels did not fall into our hands. The captured bombs were 81 mm, while our lone barrel was the 3-inch type. It was therefore not possible for us to use those bombs. I sent frantic messages to Enugu, explaining that our northern flanks had been breached and that we urgently needed support weapons. Federal troops soon resumed their advance by leaps and bounds, sometimes making 10 miles a day. Igboba had deployed his 19th battalion forward on the same axis to reinforce the badly battered companies of the 11th. Still, these were not sufficiently equipped even to slow down the rapid advance of the federal forces, which were a division strong and were well equipped with up-to-date weapons. They were also aided by white, mostly British mercenaries. Soon, Auchi was threatened, and there was yet no response from Enugu, and Banjo was not allowed to come down. After waiting a number of days, and I decided to take up the matter personally at Enugu. This became urgently necessary because in the meantime, Colonel Akaga, whose battalion was yet deployed along the Ore axis, was lost in part. Along Ore axis was lost in part of the forest westward of Benin. The news of his loss was startling and dismaying at a time when we already had a hot war in our hands. So I left for Enugu to intimate the commander of the Liberation Army with details of the situation. In Enugu, I found my way to the flat where Banjo was staying and told him everything. I particularly warned him that if he would not come to Benin, I would also not return there. My reasons were twofold. First, our hope of going further west was sinking fast, and it did not even seem as if our stay in the Midwest was secure. Secondly, I knew that Ojukwu was very difficult to work with. I had had the experience in Kano, and it was not funny. If Banjo, his friend and co-equal, could not successfully work with him, how could I, who had hardly seen eye to eye with him, how could I, eye to eye, I'll take that again. I jumped the line. So I, who could hardly see eye to eye with him at any time, we would in all probability be pulling in opposite directions. If that was allowed to happen, I knew too well we would suffer for it. Therefore, I was most anxious to avoid taking direct orders from Ojukwu. I would rather that Banjo took orders from him and I from Banjo. Banjo took the Midwest problems quickly to Ojukwu. When he came back, he was optimistic that we would get some help and we would both return to Benin. I was relieved. Then I telephoned His Excellency and got an appointment to see him the next day, simply to pay him my compliments. After that, I took up accommodation at the Progress Hotel and spent the evening with my friend, Ifea Juna. The next day, I drove to the State House and saw His Excellency. It was all pleasantness. He congratulated me on regaining my freedom, and I thanked him for it. After that, we discussed tactics. His views was that the federal government did not have sufficient troops to be engaged on many fronts at the same time. As such, he proposed to do another surprise advance towards Ilorin. This will force Gowon to withdraw his troop both from the Unsuka and the Midwest. If that happened, he himself would recover in those abandoned places and then spring another surprise. He firmly believed that the federal government could not win the war, but would soon be forced to abandon the costly enterprise. At that stage and time, I did not share his optimism at all. I could see that he had grossly underestimated the federal might and had overlooked the ill effect of his own utter lack of preparedness and loss of very valuable moments of action. All the same, I was not in the mood to argue with him, and in any event, I could not have convinced him. Rather, I brought up the problems of the Midwest and the reverses we were suffering, and asked what exactly he could do to help us most urgently. We both studied the map together. We saw the problems. He thought for a moment, then promised me immediate aid. Incidentally, he had a mortar barrel of 81 mm. He would give it to the Midwest. I was very pleased, almost happy. I gave him a decent salute and left. 2 days later, a number of rifles were released to us, and the lone mortar barrel was also given us. Boxes of ammunition were added, and we were ready to go. I traveled earlier than Banjo in order to organize the reinforcements for the Auchi front. Surprisingly, Igboba was around again to make an urgent request for reinforcement. He also disclosed that the men were not doing well at all, and that at the slightest prompting, they would desert the front, skip the battalion headquarters, and make their way straight to Benin to sleep in one of the school dormitories or terrorize civilians in the town. I promised to see those soldiers soon. It was at this time that a new person reported to me. He introduced himself as Major Achuzia. He claimed to have fought for the British in South Korea and to have fought with the Chinese in their wars. He was, however, a mechanical engineer by profession. He claimed further to have been sent from Enugu to join the Midwest operations because he hailed from Asaba. I welcomed him warmly and told him that we were always in need of more officers, especially veterans. He followed me to one of the dormitories occupied by the deserters. On getting there, I gave orders for the men to assemble. There were more than 200, most of them with weapons and ammunition. They looked well and able-bodied. There was no reason for them to be around. Their main complaint was that federal troops were accompanied by white mercenaries. In a very angry mood, I reprimanded them for deserting the front. I reprimanded them for deserting the front. I reminded them of the purpose of the war and threatened to shoot them down if they did not awaken to their duties. To show that I meant what I said, I cocked my submachine gun and fired a few shots into the air. Many of them shuddered, and a few made to run away. But I warned them that if they ran, I would finish them. After that, they quietly filed into waiting vehicles and were driven off to the front. A few hours later, Achuzia disappeared from my headquarters. After a few days, Igboba was back again with very bad news. Auchi had fallen. The troops would not stay to fight and were running back to the battalion headquarters. This time I jumped into my staff car and drove straight to the battalion location, where I saw the troops milling around. I ordered them to assemble and inspected them. I packed out a few of them and sent them on physical punishment. I spoke to them again and assured them that I would set up a field court-martial to try all deserters and that those found guilty would be shot. This last condition seemed to have had a telling effect on them, and after that, fewer ran back. The next day, Igboba was around again with the news that the enemy was almost at Irua Junction. From there, they will most likely send a force of 1 brigade strength to Agbo in order to intercept our communications and most probably cut off our link with Biafra. Also, it did not want to continue with the job because the federal side had a preponderance of weapons and were assisted by white mercenaries. In addition, he was utterly disgusted with our troops. I persuaded Igboba to return to his duties, but he would not budge. Since the commander was around, I took Igboba to him. Igboba repeated his situation report and his own decision not to return to the front because, he explained, it was too hopeless. The commander coaxed him to return to the front using persuasion, cajolery, threats, and inducements, all in quick succession. No response. Then, what did Igboba think that his example would be to others? No answer. The commander ordered him to be sent into detention at once. He was escorted to Benin prison, where he was detained. The only senior officer who was around and immediately available was Major Odiwo, who was once an infantry officer in the Nigerian Army, but transferred to the newly formed Nigerian Air Force in early 1964. I summoned him quickly to take over the operation in Irua front. He was ready and willing. That same night, I went around the dormitories and gathered some of the war front deserters. They were slightly more than a platoon in strength and had weapons and ammunition. Their task was simply to do some snipping raids and harassment on the enemy before dawn, so as to upset him and disorganize his plans for the following day. I briefed Major Odiwo on his duties, and he claimed that he understood it and would do it very well. I mounted the troops in a truck and carried Odiwo in my staff car to the front. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. We drove close to the enemy position, but they were not aroused. We got out of the car and walked closer to the enemy in order to form up. We saw a woman who was escaping from the enemy position, and she indicated to us that they were quite close. Major Odiwo briefed his men, and they formed up and moved towards the enemy. I turned back and returned to the headquarters. That was the last I saw of Odiwo till the end of the war. A few days later, his name was announced as having crossed over to the federal side. The dearth of senior, well-trained officers that faced us in the Midwest operation was not easily explained. There were no less than 14 senior officers of the ranks of major and above in the region when the Liberation Army moved in. Of course, only 3 were known immediately to have escaped to the federal side. One claimed to have wounded himself while trying to escape from the area of military firing, and he was hospitalized throughout the period of the Midwest War. Of the remainder, only 5 stayed to operate with us. Others simply crossed over to Biafra and were variously employed. As soon as I was back at my headquarters, I signaled Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuka, the commander of the 18th Battalion in Warri, to report to Benin immediately. for a new deployment. He reported and I briefed him on the war situation and told him that I was sending him to the Irua front. Fortunately, Captain Adeleke, who had been with us since the coup, had just been sent to us from Enugu headquarters.